I wanted to welcome everyone to our first webinar of 2022. My name is Elena Sokova. I'm the Executive Director of the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And I'm really happy to see that we have such a large number of attendance already for the first webinar. Everybody's still hopefully recovering from and relaxing and nice holiday seasons. Happy New Year to everyone. Hopefully it brings us all the necessary relief from all these limitations and we could see each other in person more often and have various events. But there is also an advantage to using some of these virtual formats, as today we have a number of you joining us from all the different locations. It's not only our first webinar of the year, but it is also one of the rare webinars where we focus not on the immediate policy developments or issues that we're facing in Vienna or other key locations dealing with nuclear issues. It is a rare opportunity to look at the theoretical underpinning of the IR theory behind nuclear weapons and nuclear order. And I'm very delighted that we have today with us Dr. Tarja Cronberg, who gave us basically a reason to gather today with her recent book called Negotiating the Nuclear Order, a Sociological Approach, which actually provides a different view on nuclear weapons and nuclear technology and existing nuclear order, where a sociology of technology, a discipline that kind of merges technology and social world and intertwines them, provides a new tool to understand the existing nuclear order, how it's developed and what are the prospects for it. And I'm very delighted that we have today Dr. Tarja Cronberg with us, who actually came to the VCDNP several times, including most recently in October, if I'm not mistaken, of 2021. And when she was actually doing research on her book, she also spent some time in Vienna with us. But she is a distinguished associate fellow at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute in Sweden. She's also a member of the executive board of the European Leadership Network in London and the chair of the Finnish Peace Union. She's also the author of numerous articles and books, including Nuclear Multilateralism and Iran Inside EU Negotiations, which was published in 2017, and Transforming Russia from Military to Civilian Economy in 2003. Looks like a long time ago, 2003. I wonder what you have written today on that subject. But anyway, it's not the subject of today's discussion, it's your recent book. And I'm very interested to hear both about the new approach that you undertook to analyze the existing nuclear order, and also what kind of recommendation and outcomes were the result of your analysis and study. Tarja, it's a pleasure to have you. Please take the microphone.
Thank you, Elena, and thank you for organizing this meeting. It's very nice to be able to present the book almost right after it has come and maybe give the long-term perspectives while we are worried about when the NPT review conference will take place in the coming months. So maybe this will give some space for more long-term thinking also. I will share the thoughts in three parts. One is first question of the sociological approach. What does it mean to have a sociological approach? There are not so many analyses from the sociological point of view in the nuclear order, in the arms control in general. And then I will go on to structure the nuclear states in terms of how they themselves structure technology and see differences in the use of nuclear technology, particularly nuclear weapons. And thirdly, I will present you the analysis which looks at the structure of the NPT and the necessary changes and possible changes, and also tries to identify a group of states that could actually initiate some of the necessary changes. And finally, I will say a few words. I'm a former politician also, so I will say a few words about the policy consequences, at least indicate some of the directions where the policy analysis should go based on this analysis. So let's take the next slide on the concepts of the sociology of technology. Just a few words. I am not going to give you a theoretical lecture on the sociology of technology, but just to note that the nuclear order is a technological order. And so in this way, it is relevant to analyze it also from different perspectives than the sort of classical IR perspective. So this will present some of the concepts. The first one is that the sociology of technologies is technology and the social arena as a seamless web. It's not, the two are not, the social world and the technological world are not isolated. It's not a question of technological autonomy. Technology is formed on a social arena and the outcome is never inevitable and often not known beforehand. This means the two relevant concepts then are a relevant social group who are forming the technology, shaping the technology in different ways, and a group's technological frame. So these two concepts are intimately tied because a technological frame defines a social group. So the nuclear order is in a way divided into social groups which have different technological frames. The further question is interpretive flexibility. Technology in the beginning is flexible in terms of how to use it. This applies both to bicycles, but also to nuclear weapons. And so if you look at Hiroshima, where it was, the bomb was used, and you look at the discussion today, take, for example, the last statement by the P5, which say that nuclear weapons are for peace and prosperity. And finally, the technological flexibility of this artifact or system becomes reduced all the time as the technology is being used. And we come to a stabilization or closure. And we can say that the NPT actually in 1995, when it was made permanent, actually stabilized the rules, or the cornerstone, as it's often called, of the technological order, of the nuclear order. So this closure can be opened if new group enters the arena with a different technological frame and actually comes with a changed perspective. And here we can see, I will present some of the changes that are taking place today. We can take the next slide. Now, if we could look at the the nuclear order and its group of states and their technological frame, I will just go through very quickly. But the nuclear order is often divided into a system of deterrence and a system of abstinence. These are the two parts of the order. And the system of deterrence is often dealt with as countries, states that have nuclear weapons, the haves, and the system of abstinence is the countries that have decided or been coerced to not to have nuclear weapons. But I have used a different divide, actually, the states, the security of which is dependent on nuclear weapons, and the states which have decided to solve their security by other means. So, and then looking at this group of states in system of deterrence, we find three. We have the P5, the 5 nuclear weapon states that, according to the NPT, have their nuclear weapons. They have a legal right to deter, and it's combined with a very strong perspective of not others having nuclear weapons. So I have called this the technological frame of the monopoly of deterrence. The next is the 4 states that have nuclear weapons but are outside the NPT: India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea. They are outside the NPT frame. NPT here means the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which is the sort of foundation of the nuclear order. And they have regional deterrence. Their deterrence preventing nuclear attacks is related to the regional deterrence. And then we have umbrella states, and this is where I differ from the normal divide. Umbrella states are states which don't have nuclear weapons, but are actually protected by nuclear weapons of others. The NATO countries are an example. There are some former Soviet countries which are examples. Then we have South Korea, Japan, and Australia. And then we have the system of abstinence, which are countries, groups of countries that have technological frames that do not include nuclear weapons. The first group is threshold states which actually have the nuclear capabilities to produce a bomb, but have decided not to do it, and they have sort of abstinence on the threshold. It doesn't take many of the countries, Brazil, for example, very long to produce a bomb. Even my own country, Finland, has nuclear facilities and could, in fact, produce a nuclear bomb. The next group is the exit states. They are, I think, in the nuclear order, a very interesting case when the goal is a nuclear weapon-free world, that there are states that have had nuclear weapons but have exited and actually abstaining today of nuclear weapons. These are the former the Soviet Union countries, but also, for example, South Africa. They are few, but they have very interesting experience in terms of the transition from nuclear weapons to not having them. The NVFZ states are the states in the nuclear weapon-free zones. There are 5 nuclear weapon-free zones, regions that have decided that they are nuclear weapon-free. They have a regional treaty and they control so that they actually are nuclear weapon-free in their security concerns. And they are interesting because they have double abstinence. They are, first of all, signatories of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT, and then they are signatories of the regional treaty. So, and none of the countries have ever left the zone, so they are very credible in their double abstinence, so to say. And then we have the states that are in the ban treaty, have signed and ratified the ban treaty, the TPNW, as I call it, the treaty to protect nuclear weapons and to prohibit nuclear weapons, excuse me. And this is a very different group of states. They actually not only abstain themselves, but they require that others also abstain. So these are this is sort of the nuclear order structured on an axis from strong commitment to deterrence and nuclear weapons to strong commitment to prohibition of nuclear weapons and commitment to abstinence, not only for themselves, but also to all. You can, of course, organize groups in many different ways, and there are groups that are excluded from this that actually are active in the nuclear order, such as the NAM, the non-aligned group, which includes countries with very many different technological frames. So it's very difficult to see their specific approach and their specific frame. So in this way, there are also country groups that are active in review conferences, but don't have a formal sort of organization, and you cannot identify a common technological frame. Secondly, there are groups outside, we can call them non-state groups. For example, ICANN is a group that has a very strong commitment to abstinence and prohibition of nuclear weapons. On the other hand, there are terrorist groups that actually are seeking access to nuclear weapons. So these groups are so far included. This is excluded. This is only the states that are in the nuclear order and the formal technological frames. And one more point to outline is that the states that one should look, if you look for what countries could be next proliferators or what countries could be the next to become non-nuclear, it is the divide between umbrella states and threshold states. There are many threshold states that may become nuclear weapon states. Iran, I think, is now the example with the JCPOA in life support. The question is, will this result in a nuclear weapon state or not? The second question is, from the umbrella states, there are 2 NATO countries that will be observers at the meeting of the TP and W in March, and they are actually NATO states that will be participating in the discussions. Also, Netherlands was a country that actually participated, a NATO country actually participating in the negotiations of the TP and W. Now, the next slide. Now, the analysis. I think this is maybe the most interesting part and maybe can give you some ideas and thoughts. First of all, the question of what is the structure of the NPT? What is the structural core of this treaty and what are the norms that are built into it? I think we can agree that, and many researchers actually do agree, that disarmament has been sort of the norm that has held the NPT for 50 years together. It has been a commitment from both the states that have nuclear weapons and those states that don't have nuclear weapons. So in a way, disarmament has held the nuclear order or this treaty together. The question is whether it is able to do it now. Disarmament has been, there's now a new treaty, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the ban treaty, and the countries that have signed and ratified this. It's a new norm, a prohibition norm that is now being introduced in the nuclear order. At the same time, the nuclear weapon states introduce deterrence. They refer to deterrence in all their statements against, they reject the prohibition norm, and they defer to deterrence in their statements. And so this means that deterrence is suddenly become visible in the NPT. If you look at the NPT text, the whole text of the treaty doesn't even say the word deterrence. And now we are facing the fact that the situation in the nuclear order is polarized. On the one hand, there are the countries that stand for deterrence, and there are the countries that actually fight for prohibition. So this is a clash of norms, and my point here is that, and you can look at the book if you're interested in the detailed arguments, that this clash between deterrence and prohibition cannot be solved within the NPT. So the point is, and that's also the title of the book, renegotiating the nuclear order means that the NPT has to be renegotiated in order to avoid the clash of norms. The second issue on the analysis is sort of the sociological part, also on discrimination and injustice. And here references to the 1965, the United Nations defined what the treaty, the Non-Proliferation Treaty, should be able to do. And it defines that there should be a balance between the obligations and the responsibilities, mutual balance between obligations and responsibilities between nuclear and non-nuclear states. And I have looked at the changes that have been taking place in the NPT and its application. And you will find that while the nuclear weapon states party to the NPT actually have increased rights, less responsibilities, they actually see their earlier temporary right to deter as permanent now and argue for it as a permanent right. They also are modernizing nuclear weapons, developing new nuclear weapons. So there's actually very few obligations for them. Also, the control of fissile material is in the non-nuclear weapon states, and they have an increasing control burden. I think it's motivated, of course, with the additional protocol and the Iran GCPOA requirements, but they are focused, targeted only on the non-nuclear states. Also, the inalienable right, the right to peaceful uses of nuclear technology, has been sort of limited during the 50 years of the NPT, where actually in the beginning, the US especially underlined that everything else but producing the device is allowed. But today, especially the US, but also others, are talking about reducing or limiting uranium enrichment, limiting plutonium reproduction. So in this way, the burden is growing on the non-nuclear states. So there's no longer a balance. And the question is, could the balance be saved in some way? There are researchers already that talk about withdrawal from the NPT because of the balance is unequal, because the legitimacy can be challenged. And so a choice could be to withdraw from the NPT, then it would be legitimate in terms of the unequal balance. There are efforts to restrict the ability to withdraw from the NPT, but so far they don't exist yet. And then the third part, which I looked is what are the social groups? How are they organized? You saw the list before. How are they organized, and could they affect change? Could they make the survival of the NPT a reality? And you can see in the system of deterrence, of course, the P5, they are the strongest, the most powerful group of states. They are well organized, not only permanent members of Security Council, they also are organized as the P5. They participate in nuclear diplomacy as the P5, as in the case of Iran. And they now make statements about their interests and views on the nuclear order. Other groups, such as the outside four countries outside the nuclear, the NPT, are not organized. The umbrella states are not organized as umbrella states. And if you look at the non-nuclear states, actually the states that do have a change potential and are well organized are the nuclear states in nuclear weapon-free zones in the Latin America, African, Central Asia, and two Pacific Ocean zones. And they are potentially a change agent since they form the majority of the world states. Some 110 states are members. They also have a double commitment to nuclear-free status. They have double abstinence, NPT abstinence, and the regional treaty abstinence. And they are credible actors. Countries have not left nuclear weapon-free zones, and none of the nuclear weapon-free zone states has a nuclear weapons program as far as we know. So they are potentially a change agent. They are well organized regionally. The problem they have, for example, if they were considering to withdraw from the NPT and try to cater for their own interests, they are not globally organized. And the Vienna Center has done an interesting study on how one could increase the organization among the nuclear weapon-free zones through coordination and information. But in order to be able to affect change, they would have to be organized globally. Their interest in the nuclear order is a very specific one. It is a question that negative security assurances, the fact that they should not be attacked by nuclear weapons, it was basically thought to be in the NPT, but was not included. It has been, there are statements and resolutions which have sort of indicated, also protocols in the regional treaties, but experts consider that these are not legally binding. And also these exceptions, first it was only if the nuclear weapon states were attacked with nuclear weapons from the zones, then they would attack again with return attack by nuclear weapons. Now it's also expanding so that there's biological, if attacked by biological or chemical weapons, the nuclear weapon states could respond with nuclear weapons. There's also a question of critical infrastructure. And so this scope of the negative security assurances, it's not legally based and it's not unconditional. So it would be an interest for the nuclear weapon-free states to use their majority, use their situation, and actually try to get the renegotiation of the NPT so that these negative security assurances were confirmed in the NPT in a legally based form. So these are the three parts of the analysis. First, the clash of norms, then the unequal balance, and the social groups as change agent. Now, I would like to go to the next slide and just indicate some policy consequences. There's a discussion of a sort of theoretical discussion on whether the sociology of technology, whether it only can describe technology in retrospect, and whether it can just explain why certain technologies are used in a certain ways, or whether they actually have some policy importance. And as a former politician, as I said, I of course feel that policy consequences are important. I will not go through them in a detailed way, but just indicate some of the policy consequences that can be read from the analysis that I have done. The first deals with regime change. There has been this idea that regime change will change the states under change understanding of nuclear technology. And it's very interesting because this is not the case. If you look at Iran, and I have, as a sort of expert on Iran, I have looked very closely at Iran's technological frame before the revolution, during the Shah, and after the revolution. And the technological frame is exactly the same before and after the revolution. So actually, regime change is not changing a country's technological frame. What it does change, like in the case of Iran, was the US and the international community's understanding of the country's frame. But this is sort of one of the more concrete on the technological frame. As I mentioned, the nuclear weapon-free states are identified in the analysis as a group of states that consist of majority, are organized, even if not globally, and they could sort of, through their actions, if they identify common interests like the negative security assurances, they could change the NPT. And maybe I should mention that actually the NPT cannot be changed if one of the P5 is against it. So they have P5 individually have a veto right on NPT changes. So a country group that would want to renegotiate the NPT and change it, they would have to use strong methods like the withdrawal, threat of withdrawal in the first phase to actually get a renegotiating process ongoing. And then finally, I have looked at differences between the two central concepts in the NPT, disarmament and non-proliferation. Non-proliferation is a question of new countries not getting new nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons, and disarmament is a question of getting rid of nuclear weapons. And these two have been sort of tied in the grand bargain of the NPT is actually a question that the nuclear countries accepted disarmament as a goal, and the non-nuclear countries accepted abstinence due to the sort of disarmament, non-proliferation connection. And actually, I looked at the history of these two concepts, and you find that they are both separated and isolated, separated and linked, and sometimes politically linked in the way that the non-aligned group defines non-proliferation as a means of disarmament in order to get disarmament into the analysis. And on the other hand, there's research which actually says that non-proliferation reduces nuclear danger and therefore also reduces the interest to disarm. So the question, my final question is, maybe one should consider separating the disarmament treaty, the TPNW, and make the renegotiate the NPT as a non-proliferation only treaty. Thank you, Elena, and I'm ready for any questions.
And I'm sure there will be plenty of them. First of all, thank you for this intellectual exercise and very thought-provoking exercise for that matter, because I'm sure there are many questions that arise, at least when I was listening to your presentation, and I also had a chance to at least read some parts of your book. Is many questions do come up, and I know that the participants also putting their questions in the Q&A, and there are some hands already going up. So I'm sure that we'll have an interesting discussion. But one thing that I wanted to maybe just before I take questions is for you to clarify two things for me. I'm still a little bit unclear what you mean by the technological frame,
Yes.
the term, because when you were speaking about Iran and its program, you were alluding that the technological frame did not change. While I see it even in the chat, somebody put it like, oh, it did change the technology, the approach to it, what has stopped, what has not. So maybe you could clarify the term itself, what you mean by the technological frame. And that's one clarification. And the second, probably a bigger question is, only later in your last slide, you speak about non-proliferation. And your analysis of the current kind of nuclear order is basically deterrence versus disarmament, and non-proliferation is not part of your kind of big picture analysis of actors and different drivers there, while the non-proliferation, even based on the treaty's name, it was one of the key driving factors for the existence of the treaty, and for at least a number of years it was viewed as one of the biggest benefits of this treaty, and it's an unusually almost universal treaty that probably that non-proliferation part of it still remains a very valid and attractive to the majority of the participants in the treaty. So maybe what I will ask you to address these two before I'll take more questions from the audience.
Yes, thank you. First, on the technological frame, it's sort of, in broad terms, it means how the group assigns a meaning to technology. And this can be many things. It can be history, for example, if they have participated in negotiations. It can be Hiroshima. You can see the Hiroshima effect in the Japan technological frame and their laws. And it can be sort of also experience and current status of technology. It is sort of formed. It is not a very well-defined in technological terms, but it's well-defined in terms of the social terms, the social group, that actually the social group has to agree. Like the non-nuclear weapon-free zone states, they have agreed that they will not have nuclear weapons, and regionally and also in the NPT. So these kind of negotiations, laws, signatures, ratifications make a difference. But as I said, it's sort of combination there. And if you look at the Iran case, there are 4 factors that define the technological frame of the Shah's regime and of the Islamic Republic's regime. One is the need to diversify oil. Shah already said that we need a plutonium economy, and the supreme leader is saying the same. Secondly, both the Shah and the Islamic Republic have supported NPT. They were one of the first countries to sign, and also even in this conflict between the JCPOA, Iran has not left the NPT. Both were very interested and determined that the right to enrich did belong to Iran according to the NPT. And both were actually, at least in their documentation and in their rhetoric, saying that they will not develop nuclear weapons. The Shah was maybe closer than the Islamic Republic has been, but in terms of actually these factors that have sort of guided the negotiations, both between the Shah and the US at that time, and now between the Islamic Republic and the P5+1, they end at the same place. The changes have been, the US has said that, for example, Iran has oil, why do they need nuclear weapons? The Shah was already talking about the plutonium economy, just to give an example. And the second question about the deterrence and disarmament. The question is that the clash of norms today is between deterrence, which the P5 and nuclear weapon states in general protect, and disarmament and prohibition, actually a stronger norm of prohibition than disarmament. And it's not a question of pushing non-proliferation to the background, but horizontal proliferation, which was the fear in the 60s and 70s, there are only 2 countries now that sort of have been on the line, North Korea and Iran. And it's actually not a major problem in the nuclear order. A much more dangerous problem is the modernization and new nuclear weapons, which the nuclear states are developing and which actually belong to vertical proliferation. So, and in addition, there's vertical proliferation, and there's also now the question of non-state actors potentially accessing nuclear weapons. So I am not saying that non-proliferation should be reduced, but I think there's more agreement on the on the horizontal proliferation, and the NPT has been successful here. And my thinking goes into the direction that the NPT should be a non-proliferation only treaty and be maintained as such. Okay.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. I'm so tempted to ask you more questions and challenge you on this whole notion of renegotiating NPT and things like that, but I'll hold myself back and have a few questions from our audience, and I think they pose a really interesting question. So I'll start with a question from Sharon Squassoni. She thanks you for your thoughtful analysis and says her comment is on the history of inalienable rights. And she said that it actually had some changes. For example, peaceful nuclear explosions were part of the NPT, but then they were considered inappropriate, and but the article still remains in the treaty. What has happened for the states to view, what has to happen, her question, for states to view enrichment and reprocessing that way. Enrichment and reprocessing, it's clearly expensive, dirty, risky, and unnecessary. So that kind of ties to your analysis of the inalienable right. So why don't you tackle that question while I'm looking at other.
First of all, I think the peaceful explosions is really interesting, and the way the NPTs has solved this is that actually nuclear weapon states can explode for non-nuclear weapon states, nuclear weapons, given that the non-nuclear weapon state does not learn anything from it. So it's a very interesting sort of border case. But the inalienable right, I think there are a lot of arguments about costs, about not everybody needing them, and so forth. But the law, the NPT as such, I think it's the legal opinion, I think it was from 75 and 90, 80 and 95, that actually the NPT allows enrichment, and it is not prohibited. And in the GCPOA, there was a case because the US said that the inalienable right, the Article 4, does not allow enrichment. And I think the expert opinion is that enrichment is allowed if it is not prohibited. So the US compromise in the GCPOA was that the GCPOA only talks about peaceful uses. It doesn't talk about the right to enrich. But I think it would be necessary, and this is an additional point, that it would be necessary in start of nuclear diplomacy, whether North Korea, Iran, or somebody else, to decide what is the definition of the inalienable right in the start of the negotiation, because you see that there is a sort of a changing view, and both in the GCPOA and in the North Korean developments, where actually the countries object to the negotiation refer to the NPT, and the negotiators, then the P5 or the sixth party, they refer to that it should be prohibited, and it's prohibited maybe like in the GCPOA by a UN resolution. So there's a very great gray area here, which should be agreed to at the initial phases of negotiations.
Thank you, Tarja, tackling that question. You know, again, I cannot refrain from my own comments and questions, but
I'm very glad if I can initiate a lot of questions.
You definitely initiated a lot of questions and comments, but No, I'll go with the questions from the audience. Maybe I'll save them for the last kind of comments. Actually, two people are asking very similar questions, and I will just combine them. It's from Ambassador Thomas Hainossi and from Paul Ingram. Both of them are asking, like, if the NPT is the only legal multilateral instrument currently in which the nuclear weapon states have taken the obligation to disarm. And if you kind of follow your suggestion to renegotiate the NPT, then would a renegotiation of the NPT that will focus just on the non-proliferation side would risk that nuclear weapon states would lose that current obligation they have. So in this way, you lose the only instrument where there is a legal obligation for them to disarm.
Yes, that's an argument, but I think you also have to look at the practical consequences of this. The nuclear weapon states are obliged to disarm. What does the British government do? It increases its nuclear arsenal by 40% recently. There's no timelines, the nuclear weapon states have not, even in this current crisis, have not promised any timeline or any concrete measures on how to proceed with disarmament. It's actually, in a way, an empty promise. It's true that the non-nuclear states and the nuclear states, they meet. At the NPT review conferences, they can confirm that disarmament is necessary, and there are both 13 actions and 64 points that confirm this, but nothing happens. And I think one should take the TPNW as a sign that actually there's some point where something has to happen. I mean, if the nuclear weapon states right now before the review conference or the next review conference promise timelines and concrete measures, then it would be a different thing. But no such promises are forthcoming as far as I can see. So the question is, and there's one disadvantage of the NPT, including both the promise to disarm, which is not taking place, and non-proliferation. And it's that you can refer to this all the time. And in front of the public, I mean, if the US public or Indian public would like to actually get rid of nuclear weapons, the country governments can say, well, we have this right to deter and it's necessary, and we have also promised disarmament. A non-proliferation treaty only and a disarmament treaty only would be very clear. It would be clear in that these countries don't sign up for disarmament, and it would make it easier for public opinion to actually, in a democracy at least, to pressure for prohibition.
Okay, then a follow-up on that comment, and actually there are a couple of questions in the Q&A section about the relationship between the NPT and TPNW overall. But you already covered some part of it, but here is also my question, because you didn't mention it in your presentation, but in your book, you actually argue that where you follow your analysis and findings, that both the NPT and the TPNW need to be renegotiated. It's like, what are the concerns that also relate to the TPNW in its current form, taking your sociology of technology analysis framework?
Yes, of course, the TPNW has some control mechanisms and verifications, safeguards, and so forth. But there is in in the sort of disarmament treaty, there's an additional condition, which is that no country should be able to go on to nuclear weapons, I mean, exiting nuclear weapons and then actually rebuilding them. And so there would be a need for maybe there is already a convention for nuclear disarmament, and I think a convention kind of thing as complementary to actually say how you reduce nuclear weapons and how you prevent from remaking them would be necessary in terms of sort of complementary document to the TPNW.
Okay, thanks, Tarja. I do have, I want to use as much from the Q&As that people post without kind of overloading the system. But there are some current events or trends that people are interested in your view. How do you assess them given your framework analysis? One of them is that there is much more debate nowadays about the relationship between disarmament and deterrence than there used to be some years ago. So what do you attribute it to? Is that because of also some new technologies that are available, both in terms of nuclear weapons development, but also the impact of other technologies possibly on the nuclear weapons and their use? Then that's one. Why there is such a rise of this discussion? What are the just overall we're observing, particularly in the last couple of years, this whole deterrence kind of discussion boom. Then the second question, also on the less on the technology itself, but more recent developments, is one of our viewers is saying that he's really encouraged by the recent P5 statements. We're confirming Gorbachev-Reagan statement. And how do you yourself view that statement? And finally, one more question related to technology is your assessment about the more recent deal UK, US, and Australia, so-called AUKUS. How do you, where does it fall in your framework analysis?
First of all, on the question of disarmament and deterrence, first you can see that the nuclear threats are increasing. I mean, the Russians have said that they would de-escalate with nuclear weapons. Nuclear weapons come up in North Korea. So actually there's, and I think the nuclear physicists of the US have the clock in 100 seconds before the midnight, which is closest it ever has been. So in a way, there is a real threat, and nuclear weapons are used as a threat in a way that maybe not has been before. But I basically think that the great change has been the fact that the nuclear weapon states now talk about this deterrence openly. It is open in the discussion, and it is a rejection of the prohibition. In order to reject the prohibition, they have to defend deterrence. And so deterrence is now being defended as a defensive thing and promoting peace and so forth. So it is the rejection of the prohibition norm, which is the really core. There's and you can say also the expression of it comes if you read the statements at the time the TPNW was agreed to, and also later when it was approved, that North Korea is used, the North Korean nuclear weapons are used as defense for deterrence. We need to deter because everybody knows what North Korea possibly may do. And I remember when the TPNW was negotiated and there was the UN ambassador from the US outside the hall and having a demonstration against the prohibition. She actually said that who believes North Korea would ever exit nuclear weapons? So also you have this use of argumentation that is being used in order to defend ultimately deterrence. Now the P5 statement on the nuclear war, I think it's good that the P5 say that nuclear war cannot be won and should never be fought. It was stated on the first time in 85, and going back to 85 is of course very fine, and Reagan and Gorbachev were the initiative takers. But if you read the whole statement of the P5, it's only a statement. It doesn't change anything. There's no promises of measures for disarmament, no timelines. It doesn't take the NPT any further on disarmament. So in a way, I interpret it as a sort of last minute before the NPT review conference, if it would have taken place, confirmation that the NPT should be maintained as is. On the UK, US, Australia, I think one of the factors that actually diminished the legitimacy of the NPT is the fact that the nuclear weapon states are in non-compliance. US made a deal with India, which was outside the NPT and should not have taken place. There is now this deal with submarines with Australia, UK, and US. They are not according to the NPT. And so if the nuclear weapon states themselves are in non-compliance and not following any of the legal basis in the NPT, then I think the legitimacy of the NPT is undermined.
Mm-hmm. Boy, there are so many good questions that we can ask, but maybe what I will do is kind of provide more of comments from the based on the questions and my own. A number of our participants in today's webinar have raised the concern that renegotiating in NPT may have an unintended consequences. I would say in my view is renegotiating any treaty nowadays is something that is unrealistic, and probably you would have never end up having as strong a treaty and with these intrusive inspections and mechanism and verification parts as we were able to negotiate in the late 60s, if it were for today. So that the question comes about unintended consequences of such negotiations, and I would probably join many of these comments myself. But one other comment that I would probably make based on looking at the framework that you proposed is the technological framework on one hand is a good way to look at it, but the technology also changes and the accessibility of technology changes as well. So if you look at the very initial discussions on how to control nuclear energy and nuclear weapons, if you go back to the Acheson-Lilienthal report and their recommendations, one of the recommendations of that report was that the technology, the knowledge is out, you won't be able to keep it under check, and the policing won't work in the long run. So to certain degree that proven to be the case. But in that, your suggestion is to kind of technology is to renegotiate some of the existing arrangements and orders. But can we look at other ways of renegotiating, say, going back to that notion of that you cannot control it. It has to be either under fully international control, all the technology, all the materials, particularly given the, as you mentioned, some new actors, non-state actors and things like that. Have you entertained this possibility in your analysis?
Yes, first on the renegotiation, I think the old NPT could survive until there's a renegotiated NPT, so you can at least see what the consequences are. And secondly, the unintended consequences normally indicate that more countries would build nuclear weapons. But first of all, we don't know this. But secondly, there's also this factor that as nuclear danger increases, this is sort of a research fact that if nuclear danger increases, also the initiatives to disarmament are more. And it could be that if countries access nuclear weapons, it would be in the interest of the P5 to actually start disarming and say no one should have nuclear weapons. So I think this is a sort of turning the argument, but it could be the fact that if they were spreading, then there would be actually very strong moments where countries like the P5 could sign the TPNW. But this is, of course, we don't know. On the sort of technological frame and changes, I think it's a basic idea of the sociology of technology that it's formed by people and that actors are forming technology. And so there's no technology out there which is autonomous in basic terms. And when we talk about all the technologies, the emerging technologies now, I think my criticism for this as a technology sociologist would be that it's actually excluding the social world. I mean, we're looking at the emerging technologies and how they may affect nuclear weapons, the use of them and so forth. There's no concern about the actors. So I think the basic analysis would be to actually look at my table of different social groups and how they see technology, and then look at the emerging technologies. What actors are expected to do what, and who should one negotiate with and why? So I really do think that, especially at times like this, when there are a lot of technologies coming, it's necessary to look at the social arena where they are developed and used.
I feel like we could go on for another at least half an hour, if not longer, but we promised to end within an hour. And I want to thank you on behalf of the VCDNP and all our viewers and listeners that you definitely provided some food for thought for many of us. And given that some of the arguments and comments that came through the Zoom and from the chat, you certainly in your work and your book really make people think about the status quo of the nuclear order and the new approach that you suggest, looking both at the actors and the technology and sociology nexus, is certainly something that deserves a review and further thought. But I think that that would leave, I would leave for many to look at your book. It's not that cheap, let me put it this way, but I'm sure that if they would like to continue the conversation with you, they could probably get in touch and continue the discussion. But on my behalf and on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you and wish you all the best and continue your research and your interesting and thought-provoking analysis. For the rest of us, I wish a very nice day or evening, and looking forward to more discussions this year on various topics related to nuclear weapons, nuclear energy, peaceful uses application, and others. Please stay safe and healthy. All the best in the new year.
Thank you for my part also. And New Thoughts was the intention of this both book and the seminar. So I hope you are returning home with some new thoughts. Thank you.